At my son's anniversary dinner, my daughter-in-law laughed at my $40 shoes, right in front of everyone. She said they looked cheap. But a week later, when her company's CEO called me on stage and thanked me for creating the brand she works for, her smile disappeared. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Subscribe today and be the first to discover gripping new stories daily. It was supposed to be a simple Sunday dinner. My son Ethan had invited me over to meet his wife's family. They lived in one of those spotless new suburban neighborhoods. White fences, fancy cars, and people who cared too much about appearances. I wore my favorite brown leather shoes. They weren't new, but they were comfortable, polished, classic, and, to me, full of memories. I had worn them the day I signed my first big contract, years ago, when I still ran my own company. But that night, as I stepped into their glimmering dining room, I caught the smirk on my daughter-in-law's face. Her name was Ava, all elegance and sharp words. She looked me up and down and said with a laugh, "Oh, those shoes. Vintage, huh? My dad used to donate pairs like that every Christmas." Everyone chuckled, softly at first, then louder, sensing her lead. Ethan shifted uncomfortably but didn't say a word. I forced a smile, choosing silence over pride. I'd learned long ago that some lessons are better delivered when the time is right, not when emotions are high. Dinner went on, filled with polite conversation, fake laughter, and the sound of expensive silverware tapping plates. Ava kept dropping little comments about my old-school charm, my simple style, and how times have changed. It was the kind of evening that tests a man's patience. Halfway through, her father began talking about business, something about his daughter working at a fast-growing fashion company. Ava's tone changed, suddenly proud. "Dad, we're working with a designer who's revolutionizing leather craftsmanship. His products are selling everywhere right now." I knew exactly who they were talking about. I had started that company 25 years ago and sold it for a modest sum before retiring. The new owners kept my designs alive, expanded the line, and turned it into a household name. I didn't say a word. Instead, I glanced down at my worn brown shoes, the same design that had built my fortune. My legacy, my life. Ava was too busy bragging to notice. She was describing my creation to impress her father, and I couldn't help but think how poetic it all was. The woman mocking my shoes had no idea she was wearing the perfume funded by my first contract, working at the company built on my vision, and laughing at the man who made it all possible. I smiled, quietly finishing my meal, because I knew, soon enough, the truth would walk in wearing its own polished pair of shoes. The next morning, I sat at my small kitchen table sipping coffee from the chipped mug I'd had for over a decade. The laughter from last night still echoed in my mind. It wasn't the first time someone mistook simplicity for weakness, but this time, it stung differently. It wasn't just Ava's words. It was Ethan's silence. My only son, the boy I'd raised on stories of dignity, hard work, and respect, couldn't find the courage to say a single word. But I didn't blame him. I blamed time, the kind that makes children forget who raised them and makes old men invisible in their own families. After breakfast, I walked into my small workshop out back. Dust covered the wooden tables, but the scent of leather still lingered. Soft, rich, familiar. On one shelf sat an old sketchbook filled with designs, wallets, jackets, and shoes. I opened it and smiled. Page after page reminded me of the company I'd built from scratch, Marston & Co. Leathercraft. Ava's fast-growing fashion company. I had started it in a rented garage in Nashville back in the late 90s. Long nights, sore hands, and a belief that craftsmanship still mattered. 25 years later, the name had gone global, even if my own name had quietly faded from the paperwork. Now, the same brand was paying salaries to people like Ava, who mocked the legacy without even knowing its roots. But I wasn't angry. No, I was intrigued. A week later, Ethan called, awkward as ever. "Hey, Dad." Ava said she's sorry if she sounded rude the other night. She's got strong opinions about fashion. I chuckled. Strong opinions are fine, son, as long as they're backed by understanding. Then he mentioned something that caught my attention. By the way, Ava's company's hosting a big event next month. New product launch. Some kind of exclusive dinner. She's helping organize it. That's when the idea came. Not revenge. No, I'd long outgrown that. This was about perspective. About quietly reminding people that respect doesn't depend on the price tag of your shoes. So, I made a call. To an old friend, Daniel Rhodes, the current CEO of Marston & Co. He'd been a young designer under my wing once, and when I sold the business, he'd been the one to buy it. Tom Marston, he said over the phone, his voice warm and surprised. It's been ages. What brings you back to the world of leather and luxury? Just curiosity, I replied. I heard about the new product launch. Thought I'd stop by. If you wouldn't mind, he laughed. Mind? You built the place. You'll be the guest of honor. I didn't tell Ethan or Ava a word. When the evening of the event arrived, I wore the same brown shoes, freshly polished, of course, and a clean navy suit. I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Nashville Hilton, filled with shining chandeliers and champagne laughter. Ava was there, dressed immaculately in a sleek black dress, directing waiters and smiling for photos. When she saw me, her face froze. Mr. Marston? What are you doing here? Oh, I was invited, I said casually with a hint of a smile. Before she could ask more, Daniel Rhodes stepped up on stage with a microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's launch is special because our brand exists thanks to one man's dream, one man's craftsmanship, one man's legacy. He turned, gesturing toward me. Please welcome the founder of Marston & Co. the man whose hands built every stitch we now take pride in, Mr. Thomas Marston. The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. Ava's mouth dropped open like she'd seen a ghost. I walked up to the stage slowly, my brown shoes echoing across the polished floor. Every step felt like quiet justice. When I reached the microphone, I smiled at Daniel, then glanced toward Ava, whose face had turned pale. Thank you, I began. It's an honor to see the company thriving. But more than that, it's humbling to see how far respect can travel, or how far it can sometimes get lost. The audience chuckled softly, unaware of the personal edge in my words. When I started Marston & Co., Drew, I had only one pair of shoes. I wore them every day. I still do, in fact. I lifted one foot slightly, the same brown leather gleaming under the spotlight. A murmur spread through the room. Some recognized the model, a classic design still sold by the brand to this day. It's not about what's new, I continued, but what lasts. The same applies to craftsmanship and to people. I stepped back, shaking Daniel's hand. Ava stood frozen near the back, unable to meet my eyes. As I left the stage, the applause washed over me. Not the applause for wealth or fame, but for legacy, and somewhere deep inside, I knew the real lesson had just begun. Not for me, but for her. The restaurant buzzed with laughter and the clinking of silverware. My son, Daniel, and his wife, Karen, had invited the family out to celebrate her recent promotion. She worked for one of the biggest fashion retail chains in the country, or so she proudly reminded everyone several times over. Dad, Daniel said, Karen's company is launching a luxury shoe line next month. You should see them. They'd put your, classics to shame. Karen chuckled, swirling her wine. Oh, come on, Daniel. Let's be honest. No offense, Mr. Lawson, but those shoes look like they've survived a world war. The table erupted in polite laughter. I smiled faintly. I'd heard worse in boardrooms, in negotiations, even in union meetings, but hearing it from my own daughter-in-law, that one stung differently. Still, I kept my composure. They've survived a few things, I said quietly, but they still walk fine. Karen smirked. Well, I hope you don't wear them to important places. At our company, presentation is everything. That's when something shifted inside me. For years, I had stayed silent, retired quietly, living modestly. Daniel and Karen knew I'd run a small business, but they never asked how small. I never corrected them. Maybe it was time to remind them that class isn't just about clothes. The waiter arrived with the check, a hefty one. Karen glanced at it and grinned. "Oh no, Mr. Lawson. Please let us take care of this. You've done enough by coming out." I leaned forward. "Actually," I said calmly, "I insist. After all, this restaurant once supplied its uniforms from my factory." Karen blinked. "Your factory?" I nodded. "Yes, Lawson Leathers. You might have heard of it. It was bought by a larger company a few years ago. The same company," I added with a slight smile, "you now work for." The air went still. Daniel's jaw dropped. Karen froze, the color draining from her face. "You worked there?" she whispered. "Owned it," I corrected gently. "Every pair of shoes your company sells still carries the logo I designed." Her hands trembled slightly as she set her wine glass down. For the first time that evening, she had nothing to say. I could have stopped there, but I didn't. I leaned back, my tone warm but firm. "You see, Karen, the world teaches us to value shine over substance. But leather, real leather, it gets stronger with every scar." Karen looked down at her plate, her confidence fading into quiet shame. Daniel avoided my eyes, clearly rethinking a few things himself. The waiter returned with the receipt. I signed it with a familiar flourish, thanked him, and stood up. "Shall we?" I said, smiling politely. Karen didn't answer. She simply nodded, her eyes glistening with embarrassment. She didn't know it yet, but this dinner, the one she thought would display her success, would soon become the most humbling lesson of her life. The silence that followed was louder than any applause I'd ever heard. Karen's expression flickered between shock, embarrassment, and disbelief. Her perfectly rehearsed smirk had vanished, replaced by wide, trembling eyes that darted toward my son for help. But he just sat there, frozen, his fork halfway to his mouth, realizing for the first time that the man he thought he'd outgrown had built an empire from scratch. I leaned back, calm and collected, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "You, see, Karen," I said softly, "these shoes, they're not from the mall. They're from the first batch of leather I bought when I started my company, 35 years ago. I've worn this pair as a reminder of where I came from. Because humility," I added, "doesn't go out of fashion." A tear slipped down her cheek as she mumbled, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I interrupted gently, "and that's the point." Around the table, the air was thick. You could almost taste the guilt and respect mingling together. My son cleared his throat, his voice trembling. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because, son," I said with a faint smile, "you learn more from people's assumptions than from your own stories." Then, just as the tension peaked, the restaurant manager, an old colleague from my factory days, approached. "Mr. Lawson," he greeted warmly, shaking my hand. "Always a pleasure to see you, sir. Still keeping your promise to wear the classics, huh?" Karen's face turned crimson. She excused herself quietly, muttering something about needing fresh air. My son followed her out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I watched the sunlight catch the scuffed edges of my shoes, I realized that dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't need validation or wealth to speak. It simply stands firm, like the leather beneath my feet. Later that night, I got a message from Karen. An apology longer than any conversation we'd had. She confessed she'd grown up thinking success was measured by price tags and prestige. But that dinner had changed something in her. A week later, she gifted me a pair of new shoes. Sleek, expensive, and beautiful. But tucked inside was a handwritten note. For the man who taught me that real worth can't be bought. I smiled, set them on the shelf, and laced up my old pair once again, because some lessons should never be walked away from.